We're all about charity here at Sex and Space, and today's shout out is for Wellington Rape Crisis. Their mission is to educate others to prevent rape and sexual abuse and provide specialist support services to survivors and those who support them in a way that is feminist, informed, sustainable and holistic. Their vision is a world free of rape and sexual abuse and the damage that it causes. Check them out at wellingtonrapecrisis.org.nz.
Sex, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the speculative interdimensional vehicle, Sex in Space. Its mission, to explore new points of view, to seek out fresh opinions, to boldly go where so many have gone before, and still somehow manage to totally miss the point. Subscribe to Sex in Space, wherever quality podcasts are found.
Hello, and welcome to Sex and Space. Here, still exploring sex across all of its infinite dimensions. This is episode 12 and the last of season 1. Stand by for season 2, dropping soon with a plethora of great guests and awesome new co-hosts. And me, of course. A few updates to rattle off quickly. You can find, and clearly you already have, this podcast on a whole host of platforms. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, etc. But just to keep things interesting, we've put some of our content, not full episodes, but tasty bite-sized clips on a new platform called Aotearoa. They're a startup out of the US and have surfaced some really interesting audio content creators. So head on over there and check them out at Aotearoa.io. That's AUDEA.io. Also, remember to keep us informed with what you think of our content too. Hit us up with any feedback at hello@sexandspace.com or via the quick and easy survey that you'll find in our link tree and our Instagram bio. You should know the handle by now, sexandspace.com. That's sexandspace.com. Okay, this episode we are featuring a natter I had with the wonderful Olivia Hall. Olivia has a master's in gender at the London School of Economics, where she wrote a thesis on women's experiences with painful sex and seeking medical support. She also has an undergraduate degree in gender and politics from the University of Otago and completed her honours in sociology at Victoria University in Wellington. Her undergraduate thesis looked at fat women's experiences navigating sex and sexuality in Aotearoa. She's also a spoken word poet and toured New Zealand performing a feminist show called How We Survive. Let's get into it.
And now, the interview.
That's pretty awesome for early on a Sunday morning. So welcome to Sex and Space. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for trusting us
No worries.
with your Sunday morning. That's quite a pile. How and where to start? Super interested in the show, actually.
Cool.
Read some reviews. Didn't see it. I have an 18-month-old. I don't get out much.
That's fair.
But yeah, it was just recently in New Zealand, right? So,
yeah, very recently.
yeah,
Over September and October, we toured.
Awesome. And it's a feminist poetry show. So you're dealing with themes, not just sex, but like gender and all the whole spectrum.
We cover a large spectrum of things from like friendship and our experiences as women essentially.
Yeah.
So we speak about some really hard topics like violence and harassment and things like that, but we also talk about body positivity. I do talk about some of the stuff I've researched in terms of sex.
Yeah.
So it covers a lot of things.
Yeah, and it was well received.
Yeah, we had the time of our lives. So I hope audiences did too. They seemed to like it.
Yeah. Some of them were in tears.
There were tears. I mean,
yeah.
Carrie and I frequently cry on stage, so
yeah,
it's not hugely surprising that there are sometimes tears in the audience as well. Yeah.
That's great.
But it's really nice. It feels very supportive, and we always sort of like talk to and hug the audience afterwards and things.
Oh,
So
that's awesome.
it's really nice.
That's so Kiwi as well.
Yeah.
Love it. That's brilliant. There were some things I'd read in the reviews particularly about your some of your parts in it, and talking about your own experiences and that kind of stuff. So is that why you sort of got into poetry?
Yeah, I think so. I think I always liked writing, and I always wrote the most about things that were happening to me and things that were really personal to me. And when I discovered spoken word, it felt like this really great combination of things that I love to do, because I love performing and I love communicating with people and I love writing. And yeah, I mean, I always say that standing up in front of a room full of people and performing a poem about something really personal to me can be easier than sitting down one-on-one with someone I'm really close to and talking to them.
Right.
So the show's an interesting mix, because obviously all of my family and friends came to the show.
Yeah.
So it was a combination of those things. But yeah, it's a really empowering way to talk about things that are really personal.
Do you find it cathartic as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Very, very cathartic, particularly performing with Carrie, having a second person, and we're really supportive of each other, makes it feel really cathartic and supported. But also, hopefully, we try to talk about things that are really personal in a way that other people still relate to, and therefore also sort of feel supported by hearing someone talk about those things that they may not have.
Well, that's
otherwise.
one of the things that I heard, that some of your personal experiences really do resonate with other people, and they're coming to you afterwards and sort of saying, "Oh my God."
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I think I talked specifically, by the end of the show, I was talking a lot about the one poem that I do that is about my experiences with painful sex. Because there were times over the course of the tour where I would take it out of the show because it felt just a little bit too much. And I worried about like overwhelming people with my feelings. But by the end of the show, I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like I'm always performing this poem. I'm not going to take it out even when I feel nervous about it. And that's because every time I did it, at least one woman would come up to me after the show and be like, that's the experience I have. And like be very, very sort of like touched that I'd talked about it, or just feel not alone. And we would always have a moment of sort of relating to each other. And yeah, so in some ways it became what felt to me like the most important solo poem that I was doing in the show, just because it felt like it was touching sort of a taboo that doesn't get spoken about that much.
Well, clearly, and reaching people and exposing a problem that the people are having. So unpacking exactly what that is, that's vaginismus, is that right?
Yeah.
Is that so? And so is that the common problem, or is the common problem the sort of misdiagnosis, or
there are so many common problems. So this is what I did my research about for my postgrad. I interviewed women who are based in London about their experiences with painful sex, and I didn't specify that you had to have a particular condition, because I know that painful sex is associated with lots of things. So it's associated with vaginismus. It's also very commonly associated with endometriosis, with vulvodynia. It can be a symptom of cervical cancer. Like, there's so many things that can be a symptom of. And also, lots of people don't get diagnosed with a particular thing. So I just wanted women who felt like they had ongoing experiences with that pain to talk about trying to get medical treatment. And yes, definitely one of the problems is it takes a really long time to get diagnosed with a lot of those things. People wait years to get diagnoses with endometriosis. And some of these things are really hard to diagnose, but everything that I can see from the study that I've done is that we don't really train doctors to diagnose this, to treat it as a medical issue even. And so I think for me, one of the key problems is just that we've normalized the idea of pain in sex for women.
Oh, I see. So
because we talk about virginity loss as being painful.
Yeah.
And everything from sex education to like pop culture presents women's experience of virginity loss as really painful. And therefore, women are taught from a young age to associate penetrative sex anyway with pain. And so I think we're already putting up these barriers in terms of women feeling like they can speak out about that, feeling like you can go to a doctor who in many cases is likely to be like, oh, some pain is normal, it'll go away over time.
Yeah.
And finding it in yourself to keep going back to a doctor and really advocating for yourself in terms of being like, I don't think this is the normal level of pain. I don't think I should have to overcome this in some way.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I've only ever had a bit of experience around endometriosis because my wife has had that, or has it. But in terms of the pain levels from penetrative sex that we're sort of talking about here, it's pretty debilitating.
Yeah, I mean, again, it will vary from person to person and condition to condition. For me and for lots of women that I have spoken to and know who have vaginismus, often penetration is not possible.
Not even possible.
Lots of women with vaginismus describe it as sort of like hitting a wall and like that's it. There's no going past that wall. Endo, sometimes they can, penetrative sex is possible, but very uncomfortable. Sometimes afterwards, there can be bleeding, there can be pain afterwards. But yeah, definitely very debilitating. Definitely not feeding into an environment where I think penetration is likely to be something people want to do.
No, absolutely. But in terms of what would maybe be a normal sexual progression, like it's pretty obvious that something's not right.
Yeah.
And that's just being...
Yeah, I'd love us to not approach sex as something that should ever really be painful for women.
Yeah.
I just don't think we're educating people to give them the tools to immediately start having sex that is not painful. But yes, I think it's pretty obvious after a certain period of time that something is wrong.
Yeah.
But I think that can be really hard to come to terms with on a number of levels. Firstly, because we just have this real desire to paint penetration as the only form of legitimate sex. So it's very hard to see yourself as a sexual person or think about how to have a sexual relationship that doesn't involve penetration, because there's an expectation that that is what sex is, and that everything else is just sort of stuff around it. And I think that's so hard. And then I think there's this really hard feeling that lots of women in my study and in other studies talk about in terms of how it makes you feel as a woman, that you're just sort of not able to do this thing that should be natural and easy and like fundamental to your relationship.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like there's a lot to overcome, and that's before you even go to a doctor and are like, I'd also like a diagnosis and some treatment, please.
Yeah.
And yeah, then the likelihood of you having a straightforward process with the medical profession seems to not be very high,
doesn't it? So the moving away from the show to the thesis that was so your findings around that are pretty consistent, are they? Is that kind of what you?
Yeah, I mean, women have lots of different roundabout journeys with painful sex, and it was really important to me to try and see what those were. So, for example, multiple of my interviewees for my thesis are not straight. I wanted to talk about the fact that you can have pain during sex in non-straight penetrative sex. But yeah, all of them, I mean, I think more than half of them never received a diagnosis of any kind. Multiple have self-diagnosed. A large number of them would still say that they have ongoing pain that hasn't really been resolved. And it depends. Like, I interviewed one woman who has vulvodynia, which was clearly really traumatic for a few years and really affected her relationship. But also she got treatment and would say that she can now have basically pain-free sex. Yeah. So there are people who totally have great experiences, even if it's a long and painful process. But I also had really sad cases of women who've spent many, many years trying to get treatment and don't think that it's got any better.
Right.
And so, yeah, the findings are sort of, they're broad. A lot of them are about needing to take sort of a more holistic approach to sexual health and well-being, in terms of the fact that, particularly with vaginismus, I think it's often treated as a psychological problem. And there are totally aspects for lots of women who have vaginismus of there being like a psychological barrier.
Okay.
But there are also very real physical symptoms. Like there are spasms that mean pain happens. And I think the medical system, particularly in the UK where it's underfunded and there's not a lot of communication between the different facets of health, split that up a lot. So you'll either be sent down a path to get psychosexual therapy or whatever, or you'll be sent down a road of them poking and prodding you a lot to see whether they can find a physical reason. And there's often no there's just no, let's treat this as a holistic thing that might involve facets of various different things. Let's talk to each other.
Well, it sounds like those two things are fundamentally connected.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, like, I don't think it's that surprising that someone who can't have sex or for whom sex is very, very painful has some form of psychological distress. Like, even if you're treating it physically, all of those people could probably do with some form of support for their mental health.
Yeah. Or at least the self-fulfilling prophecy in your head that this is going to hurt, and then you get anxiety and all the rest of it as well. So, it seems pretty obvious.
Exactly. I think the best, and I got this really good explanation from a doctor once who was like, if someone was coming at your eye with a finger, your automatic reaction would be to squeeze your eyes tight shut.
Absolutely.
And that becomes a trained response to protect yourself from harm.
Yeah.
And when your body has decided that penetration is painful for you, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to clench up and become tight, and it's not. It's going to believe that's an ongoing thing.
That's a complete unwiring of your brain.
Yeah, exactly.
To sort that,
and that's not just going to be a physical thing that you train your muscles. You're also going to have to train your mind to relax during that, which is easier said than done. So
clearly, so actually, that is in terms of the sort of treatments for these. I mean, obviously, there's a broad range. Have you found that some of the best stuff is a sort of mixture?
Yeah, I think so. And again, I mean, vaginismus is what I know most about because it's what I have, and it's what so many women that I've spoken to have. And vaginismus is generally treated at the point in time that you get a doctor who actually knows what it is and is confident that's what you have, is largely treated by giving you a set of dilators, plastic or silicone dilators, and telling you to go home and essentially dilate yourself until it doesn't hurt anymore.
Okay.
And research suggests that it works, but it only works if you stick with it. And depending on how severe or debilitating your vaginismus is, that's essentially asking someone to go home and put themselves through torturous pain on a day-to-day basis.
Sounds like some Victorian
torture.
Yeah,
it does.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, this is the solution, and it's great, and you can do it, and 70% of people get better. And I'm like, okay, but you have to
endure the pain.
You have to endure the pain. Yeah. Every time you're doing that, you're actually reconfirming for your brain that it hurts.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's that surprising that lots of people, including me, are like, nope. You can't even give me a time frame for how long I'll have to do this. I'm not just going to for an unlimited period of time.
Yeah.
Like, I have to put aside half an hour every day for my daily torture.
Extreme torture time. Yeah. That's madness.
And then I think
if that works,
and
statistically, then
it's great that works for people. But
isn't that amazing that if it does work, then 70% of people who it's been successful for have gone through that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's exactly why there are lots of other things that should go along with it, because lots of people will see like a pelvic physio or some kind of physio that can help them also think about relaxing their muscles. They'll also see, some sort of psychologist or something so that they can talk about, the mental impact of doing that on a day-to-day basis. So there are lots of things that probably need to go alongside it. And I think what is particularly unhelpful is when you get a doctor who gives you dilators and is like, the main thing is that you're just not relaxing. Like, if you could just relax. And so the big thing I got was like, lie down each day, like put on some calming music and like lie down and do your dilation for half an hour. I was like, what world do you live in? Like, I can't just light candles and lie down and this pain's not going to be there anymore. And mine was clearly like I have very extreme vaginismus. It was extremely painful. But yeah, to go to a doctor and say penetration's not possible and have them be like, well, the solution is a lot of penetration.
Yeah.
was
With some meditation.
was
Yeah.
pretty scarring.
Yeah.
And one of the other things I found in my research, which was one of the most interesting to me, was how much these women really just wanted someone to have a conversation with them about the idea that they didn't have to have penetrative sex. How nice would it be for there to be a conversation at any stage about how you could have a fulfilling sexual relationship that didn't require you to have penetrative sex?
Yeah.
And that said, actually, if this is extraordinarily painful for you, what if you didn't do it?
Yeah. Let's try some other stuff.
What if you stopped
Yeah.
trying to do that because you feel like you have to?
Yeah.
And no one was ever getting that from
No.
anywhere.
And that would be so beneficial from a psychological point of view as well. That
Yeah.
sort of release of expectation
Yes.
would probably go a long way to helping.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it would but also it would just revolutionize the way we talk about sex in such a positive way to
Yeah.
not be so focused on this idea of this very heteronormative idea of penetration
Sex
is
yeah,
sex.
especially when it's like the loss of virginity.
Exactly.
You know, everyone's kind of chasing that around, aren't they, when they're younger?
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
I just think so many of our ideas about what sex is and what you need to be doing are based around this really harmful notion that you're not having sex if you're not having penetrative sex.
It's interesting, actually. Just recently on the podcast, we've talked to people about that virginity myth thing.
Yeah.
And I sort of had it unpacked for me because I hadn't really kind of explored it, and I think that's really interesting. It seems so obvious when you think to yourself, okay, so all of my lesbian friends who
Yeah. Are we just saying they've
have maybe
never
had
had
sex? Yeah. Oh yeah, of course they're all virgins. It's like no, that's not true.
Yeah.
And also, I like the idea of it being something which you can kind of own yourself from a point of view of like, okay, well, I'm sexually active now.
Yeah.
Maybe I've chosen not to have penetrative sex, or
Yes.
I don't want to, or whatever it is. But
Yeah.
I'm a sexual being now. So
Absolutely. I think that was one of the hardest things for me because I'm in a long-term relationship that I've been in for almost the entire time that I've been sexually active and the entire time that I've gone through this process of getting diagnosed and then trying multiple treatments for vaginismus. And it's exhausting and it's hard to feel like you have to defend the idea that your relationship is legitimate and that you have a sexual relationship that just doesn't include penetration.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as a teenage boy, I was my first proper girlfriend. We didn't have sex, and it was a real thing amongst my peer group.
Yeah.
And of course, teenage boys are ridiculous, but it was it was a thing. So what have you done then? Like
Yeah.
all
Oh,
this kind of
absolutely.
stuff.
The grading that we give to different
Yeah.
things that you
Yeah.
can do sexually, and
Exactly.
you have to advance through the list.
Yeah, it's a real shame actually, because I think it did. We're not going to talk about me or my first girlfriend, but it did add a bit of pressure.
Yes.
As well. I think she maybe felt like she sort of had to do things she didn't necessarily want to do, all that kind of stuff. So it was and it's not the fault of any of my peer group necessarily. It's
a
a
cultural
thing.
Yeah, it's a cultural expectation that's placed on, and it happens as soon as you're in a relationship, particularly if you're in, I think, a heterosexual relationship, because that's what all of our cultural norms are around. As soon as you have a girlfriend, it's like, well, you must be having sex, because otherwise you're just friends. Like, what is your relationship if it's not sexual? Because we're very bad at sort of identifying that there are other things that are different about relationships that exist outside of sex. But yeah, I think there are so many things that flow from that, because, I mean, also in my research, I've talked a lot and thought a lot about how often penetration is not satisfying for women, how often women don't orgasm and don't find penetration alone to be sexually fulfilling. And again, this focus on penetration just says, oh, but this is the act. This is
sex.
what you do.
Yeah.
This is sex.
Yeah. It's not the rolling around for an hour before.
No,
Having
and we just
loads
let
of fun.
I feel like we let people off the hook by just being like, that's it. You just have to do that. And if you've done that, I mean, it's not your fault if your girlfriend doesn't get off because you're doing what you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like if we just stopped and treated all of it as sex, there'd be way more encouragement to like explore each other's bodies and figure out what is pleasurable for each other, even if that means you're not always having penetrative sex.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
And now my mind is back to when I was 17.
How great it would have been to know these things.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be nice.
That's the other thing as well, isn't it? Is when you're younger, you really don't know about avenues of like healthcare, what to do, who to talk to, that sort of stuff. I mean, this is all sort of part and parcel of our broader conversation about sort of sex education, formal or otherwise. And one of the main things is kind of the lack of information that you're given for your sort of formative years. And if you're experiencing these things and you don't even know who your doctor is.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're getting all of, I mean, if you're a young woman, you're probably getting half your information from Cosmo magazines. I definitely got more information from magazines than I did from my formal sex education.
Yeah.
But also that's really problematic because those are exactly where I got the stories of, oh, sex is really painful for me. And everyone's like, that's normal.
Yeah. Some agony aunt page or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's this, I just can't believe when I think back how much of my teenage years, the discussion and discourse around sex mentioned pain and how rarely it mentioned pleasure. Like it was never talked about as something that should be a pleasurable experience. It was something you do. It was something that could lead to, you having a baby. So you had to think about contraception.
Yeah.
And that was it. Might be painful at first. It'd get better. End of.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, sort of what's coming to mind is other conversations we've had around things like portrayals of pleasure in porn as well. I'm in my late 30s now, and so my sort of formative years weren't as influenced as porn as apparently people are now, like younger people who sort of find it much younger than I did, basically.
Yeah.
And there's interesting discussions around portrayal of pleasure and pain for women in porn. So, penis size, all these kinds of things. So also particularly unhelpful, I'd imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, just not enough discourses that are breaking the norm or questioning this generic idea of pain as something that we should just deal with and it'll go away. And it's so hard because some of the women I spoke to ultimately found they were much better getting support from other women who had that experience, from building a community. There are great networks and communities in big cities like London where you can meet other women who have vaginismus, which blew my mind when I first found out about it. I was like, imagine when in Dunedin a doctor finally said the word vaginismus, if they'd been like, and here's a support group you can go to and meet other people who have this experience because you are not this crazy single person who has this problem.
Yeah.
But lots of women have found that is better for them. There are great companies that make sex toys who now also make vaginal dilators that are not supposed to be so medical and supposed to allow you to actually approach doing that with some idea of it leading towards pleasure and it being an enjoyable sexual experience. Wild.
I can't imagine anything that you get given from your doctor
I know.
to be associated with pleasure.
Exactly.
Goody.
These hard medical tools. And so actually talking to other women for them was really helpful because doctors have such a lack of information about this, you're not going to a doctor and having all of the options laid in front of you and having them go, well, you could try psychosexual therapy, you could try a physio, you could try dilating, you could try all of these things at what, like, you're not getting those options. So women I interviewed would be like, I'd never even heard that anyone went to a physio until 2 months ago when I spoke to someone at the Vaginismus network. And they've been on this journey for like 6 years.
Wow.
And it's just crazy that you just don't get that information. You're much better talking to other women who've actually gone through it and been like, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, this might work for you. So lots of women found much more comfort and support in that. But there was still this really nagging thing that I think we all held on to in terms of wanting the pain to be legitimized. And I think that's why you keep going to doctors, even though it's exhausting to keep trying to advocate for yourself. Because you really want this person who has medical knowledge to say, I know what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
It's a real thing. Your pain is real and legitimate. And we care about it and we're going to do something to fix it.
Here's our rubber stamp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. So, yeah, you want to know that it's not all in your head. And there were so many interesting points around that came up when I interviewed these women who would have other symptoms alongside painful sex. So like they were bleeding, often really clung to those things because they didn't feel like they could prove to a doctor that they were in pain during sex. But if they had a physical symptom like I'm bleeding, they felt like it would be harder for a doctor to ignore that. So they'd go in being like, I'm bleeding, you have to help me. Like that is a medical issue. Whereas, there was this weird feeling that you couldn't prove just saying that you had pain during sex. And you couldn't prove that it was something bad enough or important enough. And I also think, all of my thoughts from my thesis that I haven't thought about for months are coming back to me. It's also so interesting to think about the emphasis that we place on the role that sex has in a really gendered way in the lives of men versus the lives of women or other groups. Because I've read lots of stories of women who, when they take their partners along to appointments, and when their partners start talking about how not being able to have sex affects them, that it's approached in a really different way. And I think this comes... And that was like horrifying to me when I worked it out. I was like, I can't believe that I'm supposed to go into a doctor with my boyfriend so that he can make them take my pain seriously. But I think it comes from this really strange perception we have that men can't live without sex, that sex is this fundamental, natural part of being a man, and you have this urge and need that you can't control, and we use that all the time to excuse behavior and say that, that's just an urge they can't control. Whereas women are sort of supposed to be more passive when it comes to sex. They submit to sex, they consent, but we don't talk about it being this pleasurable thing. We very rarely talk about them taking on more active or dominant roles within sexual relationships. And so because of that, I think we've fed this horrible idea into our culture that sex is something men deserve and just something that women have or put up with or do.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's really easy to be like, oh, sex is painful, but like if you can do it, that's all that matters. And that was kind of the approach. Even with dilation, it was like, I mean, we're not working towards pleasure here. We're working towards you being like, well, you're healed because you can technically be penetrated. Technically, something can go inside you, so you are fine.
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, all these women are like, that's not really what I would consider this issue being resolved. Yeah. Like I'm going through all of this pain and the response is, well, as long as it can go inside you, like now you can swap a dilator for a penis and therefore you're having penetrative sex and therefore...
Yeah, my job here is done.
Problem solved.
Yeah, problem solved.
It's like I still don't want to do that because it's still very unpleasant, and even if it's not explicitly really painful, it's probably uncomfortable and we're not thinking about pleasure. Yeah. It's frustrating, the gendered nature of it.
It is actually, and imagine having to take your partner along. New
Get a
partner,
doctor.
old partner, So, I really met this guy.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you. We've been on 2 dates. Could you please come to a doctor with me? Because they don't think there's anything wrong, and there really is. I know, it's just wild. But also, it was also crazy to me that, like, they're hard to diagnose, but the idea that doctors have never been taught about vaginismus or vulvodynia, or that until 15 years ago it was even much, much harder than it is now to get an endometriosis diagnosis. But we have ads and window campaigns at Boots for erectile dysfunction.
Yeah.
Everyone knows how to, millions of dollars have been funneled into ensuring that men can have sex.
Yeah. It sure has. It's a big industry.
Yeah, a huge industry.
Yeah.
I'm like, why don't you want to make a huge industry out of genuinely helping women who would also really love to have pleasurable sex?
Yeah. The endometriosis one's an interesting one, only because of my wife's suffering, but it's, I've heard sort of anecdotally and through various things that they can take a really long time to be diagnosed.
One of the studies that I saw was the UK one that says it takes between often 6 months and 9 years of having the problems to get an official diagnosis.
And it's really
hard.
Prolific.
Yeah, it's really prolific.
Yeah.
And we have started sort of running campaigns about endometriosis and things, and there's been this massive upsurge in awareness about it in the last few years. And I was so fascinated when I was living in the States. There was like a TV commercial that was essentially about endometriosis, and you could tell that essentially the point of it was to educate the public because doctors don't know about it. So it was like, if you have this, this, and this, there is a good chance you have endometriosis, and you need to go to your doctor and say, I think I have endometriosis, because the most likely thing that will get you a diagnosis is you self-diagnosing and then telling your doctor to diagnose with it.
Here's how to spell it. Go Google
exactly.
it. Yeah.
And obviously, I mean, there are difficulties with it, because I think to technically diagnose it, they won't officially diagnose it until they've actually seen that there is endometrial cells, which involves like a laparoscopic surgery. So it's not quite as simple as just being like, tick box, you're diagnosed. But the fact that it takes so long for it even to come up in discussions with doctors, because again, wanting that reassurance is partially like wanting a name that I can go home and research and feel like I have some control over finding out my own information. That's what's so nice, I think, about getting, even if it is not that hopeful, and even if a doctor's just saying, here are some unpleasant dilators, I still felt like I had more power once I had a thing that I could look into.
Yeah, otherwise Dr. Google is
exactly.
probably going to drive you mad.
Yeah.
And you're always going to end up at something horrendous.
Yeah, so you're always, I think you are. And also there's just that nice moment of being like, well, it's terrible, but that is definitely what I have, and other people definitely have it, and now I can talk to people and I can figure out what works for me, because it's clearly not a one method works for everyone.
And so in terms of the thesis and sort of what you found, what have been the best outcomes for women? Were there none? Or
no,
there have been some.
There have been some.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think it's a couple of things based on, so the last question that I asked in every interview that I did for my thesis was, if you could go back again and start the whole journey again, what would you want from the healthcare professionals that you went to see? What would change how you felt about it? And what was so crazy to me is that the things these women were asking for were not medical miracles. These women weren't saying, I want every doctor to be able to immediately tell me on my first appointment what is wrong with me and give me 7 options that will make it go away. No one was even saying they have to be able to make me all better. They were saying, I want doctors who will take it seriously, who will acknowledge that pain is happening and that it must be really hard and that they're going to try and do something about it. And then they want sort of that ongoing support, whether that's giving you the ability to talk to other women with that experience, giving you the ability to treat it as both a sort of a physical medical problem, but also something that you might want psychological support for. Just allowing it to be sort of an ongoing journey where the woman themselves doesn't have to make every single step. And that's particularly hard in the UK because with an underfunded NHS, it's not even is it very, I mean, it's very hard and often very expensive to get any sort of specialist treatment. But also to get anywhere, you have to go through your GP. They give you referrals. And clinics are so busy, you often don't see the same GP more than once, and you see them in 10 to 15 minute slots. And I just can only imagine, having gone through all of my medical experiences in New Zealand with this and the States, can only imagine how frustrating it must be to feel like you're starting at square one every time you make an appointment. Because every time you get a new doctor, that entire 15 minutes is going to be spent giving the backstory to why you're at yet another appointment about this, and trying to explain that, no, it's not the normal amount of pain, and here's what I've already tried. And you need a more ongoing support system than that.
Yeah.
And lots of women are finding that in non-medical things, in having support networks and being able to talk to each other. And then the other thing is just, we have to change the cultural conversation, because it's alarming how often women who have these conditions are like, well, thank God I found a good guy who's willing to put up with the fact that I can't have sex. I'm like, but you're clearly an amazing person. Like, are they actually putting up with anything that crazy? Do we need to treat it as though you're so dysfunctional and such an incomplete human being that, like, you're lucky that you found a partner that is willing to be there for you? And that definitely is the cultural conversation. And lots of people who were in queer relationships didn't have that, and really felt, because the process of queering sex is already going far beyond talking about penetrative sex. They're far more likely to be having open conversations and considering sex more broadly. So people who were in queer relationships were often the ones who still found ways to have really positive, ongoing sexual relationships, because it's very common, particularly with sort of vaginismus or something that doesn't even really allow penetration, for people to completely shut down and then stop trying to do anything sexual, because everything reminds you of and is associated with this pain. So often doctors will be like, I mean, are you having any sort of sex? Because it's very common for them not to be. But I found that people who were in queer relationships often didn't approach it that way, and were far more likely to be open to trying other things and talking through, and didn't feel ashamed to be talking through different ways to have those relationships. And that just comes down to what we teach about sex and how we talk about sex.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now, this.
Barbarella's Geflottelceta. The planet Barbarella's orbit is about to drift out of parthenogenetic space, meaning it will soon be business as unusual for the galaxy's premier sexual therapy center. In the meantime, they pass the time as best they can.
Okay, who would you slay? And you can't count reparted. Everybody hates them anyway.
What a wormhole.
Oh, whose idea was a passive-aggressive head of a jar?
So, slay.
Angset from Copravaldiv. Caught it following me into the latrina with a scooper. Said it was redecorating.
Belly of Frictus for me.
Why belly of Frictus?
She just reverse rubs me.
Okay, with whom would you spawn?
Ambigua. Who wouldn't want to with a shapeshifter?
Debra Fortunas. Bodies don't get any more heavenly than that.
Responsive quality. Okay, who would you subjugate?
Oh, Alicia the Acquiescent. The clue's in the title.
That cute little Andromedan from accounts payable for mine. Every time it brings the slips round, my throbula becomes so engorged I can't see for an hour.
Salutations, fellow labourers of love. As you know, we are about to leave Pathospace, and it will soon be business as unusual. To that end, I've just jumped off a hypersite copulink with the high-legate of Fluckwhimper 9. Turns out, this Cartesian unit closes the third megalenium since the Fluckers first stood on 3 legs and looked longingly at the stars. To celebrate this evolutionary milestone, they want to hire out Barbarellas for their top executroids for an entire galactic week. Oh, come on. You know the Barbarella's maxim. All species, all genders, all welcome. So, no new bookings from next Newton Day, and the Menagerbots will be around to put down the plastic.
Will the Fluckers pay up front? Do they require specialist equipment? If you're a helium breather, does oxygen make your voice really deep? Tune in next temporal unit to find out.
Your pleasure is our business.
And now to more weapons-grade content.
So interesting. I could talk about this all day, but should we move on to the other thesis?
Oh, yeah.
How far back are we going now? Are you...
Going back to 2016.
We're going back to 2016.
Yeah. It's okay.
It sounded really interesting to me.
Yeah.
One question I had.
Yes.
We throw like... I don't want to trip up on any words, but the word fat.
Yes.
Fat woman's
I was like, I know where
experiences.
this is going. Yeah.
Like, is that an accurate and sort of okay description? Is it something that people would define themselves as?
Yeah,
Or would they rather be described? I don't know, in any other ways, or is it a personal thing? Like,
It's a personal thing. So lots of people would, I'm sure, not like to be described that way.
Yeah.
But only because of the vitriol
Precisely.
that we have associated with that word.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been really important to reclaim that word to some extent, to be like, this is a descriptive word that is useful for me describing my body. So...
you would use it to describe my body too.
Like...
because it's literally true, but yeah, I see
yeah,
what you mean,
like it's a useful descriptor for me. And within sort of body positivity, there are lots of different things people use, right? Like because it's political as well. People will call themselves small fats or super fats or different things depending on
there's a whole
sizes.
world
There's
that I
a whole
need to go to.
world
Yeah.
of body positivity. But yeah, for this it was really important to me to not try and play around with other terms. And actually early on in the thesis I explain why I'm using fat as opposed to using because the two common things also that you would use otherwise are like overweight or obese. You're like using these very medicalized terms or like I hate overweight because it's like over what weight? What is the normal weight? So I didn't want to use these sort of these like horrifically medicalized terms. And beyond that you're getting into sort of like things that people might use to refer their body, but that are not that useful as descriptors, like curvy or chubby, or you know, you can. There's any number of things you can use like that.
Yeah.
But fat is actually, if you take away the extreme societal reaction to it, just a simple word.
Yeah.
And we would let people say they were slim or skinny, and I was like, that's fine. And like that means that I got a particular sample. I got people who were far more likely to have gone on a process of being comfortable thinking about their bodies in that way.
Yeah.
But I was okay with that. I just wanted people who, and it wasn't like I was like, you must be this particular size or you must be over this size. I knew that people who had gone through a journey of comfortably identifying themselves as fat would have done that because they had experiences with fat phobia and things like that. So that, you know, people don't just call themselves fat on a day-to-day basis for fun. That's a journey to feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah.
And all of the women I got self-referred themselves to speak to me, and were all perfectly comfortable using that word.
And so it was a fat woman's experiences navigating sex and sexuality?
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to talk to fat women about sex because truly nobody talks about it ever at all. And obviously, like, there are practical differences in terms of the ways that you may have sex, depending on the size and shape of your body. But I also wanted to talk about, particularly in this sort of modern age of dating apps and far more casual sex and things like that, what it was like to try and navigate that as a fat person, and particularly as a fat woman. So, you know, multiple of the women I spoke to used dating apps and talked about having sort of learning at what stage and they needed to acknowledge their body weight or their body shape, because they didn't want to show up and meet a person and have them then be like, oh no, I'm repulsed by your body.
Oh, I see.
Get away from, you know, when you're not meeting someone in a bar, you're meeting someone over an app.
Yeah.
And it's very easy for photos not to be clear.
There's all the trappings of the photos not being quite...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so actually lots of the fat women I spoke to and that I know are really upfront about it, and will specifically try to use photos that make it clear that they're fat, or will acknowledge it openly on their profiles, because there are also people all over these apps that are like no fatties and things like that. So it seems like like hard territory to navigate. And then I was also just intrigued by lots of these sort of particular ideas about fat sex that I knew about or had heard about, just because, obviously those practical things in terms of ways that you might have sex that are different to other people, but also is this really interesting idea from an academic called Gailey about fat women as being hyper invisible. So they're both just invisible, because in a sexual space we often don't talk about fat women as sexual. We like to desexualize them because their bodies are not what we would normally associate with being sexy. But then they're also hyper visible because their bodies obviously physically take up more space, and so they're often noticed in rooms and things like that. And these sort of two things occur at the same time, where they're really visible to people, but we're also ignoring them in this realm of sex and sexuality.
Yeah. Or triggering two feelings at the same time, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And because we don't paint them as sexual beings, there are lots of people who are perfectly comfortable having sex with fat women, who are attracted to fat women, but who are deeply, deeply uncomfortable or ashamed of the fact that they feel that way. So it's very, very common for fat women, including the fat women that I interviewed for that thesis, to be having sex with someone who doesn't want it publicly known that they're having sex with you.
Goodness, really?
That wants it to be a secret, that doesn't want to, and that can be like they may be really upfront about that, they may be open that they want it to be a secret, or it's more just, I want to sleep with you a lot and see you a lot, but we're not going to like go out in public together, and I'm not going to let you meet my friends. So this sort of being a secret because someone is really ashamed of being attracted to your body.
Right. So is that almost a sort of taboo but fetishized in a way?
And I mean there also then there's the added layer that the fact that people are ashamed about it means it's been turned into this fetish, and porn sites have BBW categories and all these things because exactly, it's been turned into this fetish, and that also plays into that sort of hyper invisibility thing. So there are all these like very complicated, and again, I think part of the reason both of these topics are so interesting to me, both, I mean, are obviously very personal to me, but also because they're both so built around sort of cultural and social ideas.
Yeah, completely. That's their immediate, that's the root cause, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because people aren't just like walking around being like, obviously I should be ashamed of being attracted to this fat woman. Society is saying you should be ashamed of that, because those are not bodies that we culturally mark as sexual or attractive. And so it was really just about finding out and sort of essentially getting some data, because it just didn't exist, about sort of the broad range of experiences that these women had in terms of navigating sex in a fat body.
That's so interesting, because I mean you're absolutely right. The information is, I mean, it's news to me. It's not out there. It's not.
I just really love talking to women about these experiences. It's really amazing how open people are and willing to share those experiences. But it's life affirming to hear other people having those experiences. I always want to get all of the women I talk to in a room together and be like, "You're not alone. These people all feel the same way. All of your data is being confirmed by other women."
So across like LGBTQ and stuff like that, was it a similar sort of story, would you say, or
in terms of the fat bodies?
Yeah.
Again, I think experiences are diverse across all groups. But yes, at least one of the women I spoke to, if not, no, more than one of the women I spoke to, would have identified as queer. And definitely, specifically, they found a difference in terms of the relationships they had with men versus the relationships they had with women. In that the particular societal narratives around bodies have a different impact on women. The requirement to be thin is more of a thing for women than it is for men, I think. Particularly in terms of, we talked about this sort of like the scope in which you're allowed to be bigger. Like men can be big in this particular way without it being like an issue that they're big, whereas women are supposed to be petite. It's like a particular thing we've decided about their gender, that they should be like small and light, and you should be able to pick them up and put them on your knee and throw them about, presumably. But because that's so drilled into women from such a young age, like, you know, there are all these horrible stories about like girls at the age of 6 not being happy with their bodies because we just drill in these particular ideas so early on. I think they often found a sense of camaraderie or understanding in their relationships with other women compared to other men, where even if that woman was thin, she was far more likely to understand that pressure and not add to it by being like, let's keep this a secret. Yeah. Let's not tell anyone about this. So that was fascinating. And then the other thing was just, unsurprisingly, people have much better sex when they're not ashamed of their bodies. And that's true for not fat women. That's just true, right? You need to be comfortable.
Yeah, it's so true, and it's so sexy as well.
Yeah.
For any body type to be sort of sexually confident.
Exactly.
It immediately makes you think, oh, hang on, like, you know, what is going on here? Like, what was all the fuss about?
Yeah.
There's this beautiful sexual being.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, it was obviously not surprising to me to you know, in my research and the other research that exists around this, which is not a lot, but there is some, that I mean, obviously you're not having as enjoyable a sexual experience if you're keeping the lights off and you don't want to get into certain positions because of the way it makes your stomach look, and, you know, and these really, just these problematic ideas that we just perpetuate about bodies, like, oh, she's bigger than him, so if she goes on top, like, he's going to die. Like, she's going to squash him. Like, that's not true. This is not how bodies work. Like, you can find things that work, but, you know, fat women often, if they're not fat women who are confident with their bodies, often don't want to do that because you're like, oh, well, then I'm putting my stomach right in his face, and, you know, there are all these things that if you're constantly, like, hiding your body, that's just not, it's not going to be a relaxing or enjoyable experience for anyone.
And you know what's interesting is sort of where you said that no one's talking about this, or, you know, even you're having these conversations for the first time with people. I think people's minds fill in the blanks a little bit. Like, if you were to, I don't know, these assumptions that you're sort of talking about, like, oh my God, you know, she's going to kill him if she gets on top. Like, it's a sort of societal myth almost, isn't it, in a way? Someone's thought to themselves, oh, I wonder about, you know, a fat girl having sex with that skinny guy.
Yeah.
How would that work?
Yeah.
And then fill in all the blanks.
Oh, I think that's definitely what happens.
Yeah.
I think I became more aware of that. My partner's very thin. I think that's partly why I became aware of it. I was like, people clearly think that we can't have sex. And I was like, this is... But also, people made assumptions about what my partner liked and that he must have this type and be into fat girls. And I was like, this is just... Maybe he's just into me.
Just into you.
Like, that's... Yeah, this real idea... Yeah, this real desire to sort of project onto why people are having these relationships and that they're not sexual or, you know, that they're fetishizing or...
Is that because it's sort of, like you said, that culturally there's the norm, isn't there? And so anything outside of that, people have to kind of try and justify somehow.
Definitely, exactly. And I think it's interesting how that doesn't work in reverse. Because the norm is men should be bigger than the women they are dating. If the man is fat and the woman is thin, there's still that still to some extent conforms to that norm.
Yeah.
Whereas the other way around really seems to throw people in terms of being like, oh, you've really mixed up our gender norms. And
so no one's ever
people
going...
don't settle well with
that
that.
small woman over there has obviously got a fetish for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that does happen, but it definitely feels like that doesn't happen as much. And again,
Well,
I think
it doesn't
that,
because I think to trust even our own immediate intuition on the subject is probably quite a good read of the cultural kind of norm. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think you're bang on with that one.
Yeah. And I think it all comes back to this idea just that we have very, very strict, narrow ideals of what women should look like.
Yeah.
And our ideas for men actually are a bit broader, I think.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's the shock that a woman is breaking. It's sort of so flagrantly breaking what we think is like the key thing, that all women should work all of their lives to be thin.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why, we can't really cope with that. Definitely can't cope with the idea of like a fat woman being like, yeah, I'm fat and it's fine. Everyone's like, what do you mean?
No.
That can't possibly be right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you still personally sort of ever find anything that you ever have awakenings of like, oh, I've actually this is not my opinion. This is sort of society's opinion or anything. Or
All the time.
Yeah.
My gender degree has basically just made me like a crazy person who's just like, I'm very critical of my own thoughts.
Yeah.
So I think because of what I've studied, I'm more likely now to have those thoughts and more quickly go, is that actually what I think? Or is that what I've been... So I'm more likely to do that questioning.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to get rid of that initial bit that just jumps to the, oh, I shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
All the time. Shouldn't wear this, shouldn't talk like this, being too loud, not conforming to this gender norm. All of the time. Because I can study it as much as I want, but it doesn't change those societal...
No.
Those expectations, which means I'm still having to decide whether to conform or break each of those norms each and every time that I do anything.
Especially when you notice them, it's like, can I be bothered to fight this one?
Exactly.
Yeah, it must
No,
be.
exactly. And sometimes you're just like, no.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just don't want to have the fight. Sometimes lots of people I know have gender degrees. Sometimes you're just going to say you have a degree in sociology because you don't want to get into the conversation about what it means to have a gender. You don't want to defend your study or your feminism, or you can't always be up for having those
complete fatigue.
those fights.
No,
yeah, exactly. But I think that's exactly right. You can't. I don't know how you break out of that initial stage of.
Yeah, I don't know.
Assuming you should do something or be something, and I have a poem about sort of coming to terms with accepting the word fat and that being empowering for me, and learning to, going on this very long journey of loving my body. And I always have to say beforehand, I wrote this poem when I was in a really good place, but you don't go on a journey from thinking one thing about yourself to thinking the new thing about yourself. And that's it. It's just like one linear progression from hating my body to loving my body.
Yeah.
And then I love my body every day for the rest of all time. Because that wouldn't be possible. Because there are days where I'll feel really bad, and then I'll also get hit with 7 ads about how it's the new year and there should be a new me and I should obviously be on a New Year diet and all of those things.
Yeah.
And they'll obviously make you go, oh, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should be dieting. So it's such an up and down journey. And even if you know that one thing is right for you, you have to fight to hold on to that.
Yeah, oh, completely. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it can be anything from a particularly bright changing room light.
Yes, exactly.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
You're like, oh my.
Yeah.
Horrible.
I'm like, realistically, I know that my body doesn't change that much from day to day. And yet there are days that I'm like, I look banging. And there are days that I put on the exact same outfit and I'm like, I'm staying inside. Like, I look terrible. And I know that's not rational.
Yeah.
So I'm like, my body is the same as it was yesterday. Yeah. But yeah, you see a photo of yourself that's taken at an angle that you didn't have control over. And
oh, I know.
you spiral.
Yeah. That's interesting, actually. One of the things I read about the scooting back to the How We Survive thing.
Oh, yeah.
Is it was in a review, and it was one of the messages or the acknowledgements that there's no such thing as this perfect feminist, perfect woman, perfect anything. And And so I suppose that's sort of similar to how we're talking. You allow yourself these moments to just be like, I'm having a
exactly
I'm having
a blah day. Yeah,
when
exactly.
I'm just like,
yes, 100%. Allowing yourself to be a human.
Yeah.
And I think, when we put these labels on ourselves, even labels that I think could be good, like being a feminist, even that comes with these like very specific ideas of what it means to be a feminist.
Yeah.
And you have to fight those all the time. Like the idea that
can't watch Love Island.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely do watch Love Island. And I'm definitely wearing makeup right now, these things that you have to question all the time. Yeah. And so the final poem that Carrie and I do together in the show is called The Perfect Feminist. And it is essentially us trying to discuss that. And at the end, we sort of list all of these things that we tell women to be. And the idea is sort of to expose that those are contradictory, that women can't be all of the things that you're telling them to be, because we want them to be curvy, to be sexy, but we also want them to be thin, and we want them to be virgins, but we don't want them to be prudes, and we want them to be mothers, but we want them, so we try to show how ridiculous it is to suggest that any woman would be able to conform to all of the things that you've suggested women should be able to. Because no one is going to be able to do that. And also, who has the time and energy to spend every second of every day being like, am I meeting this requirement?
Well, also, the thing that was mentioned in the review is that it's a weapon.
Yeah.
To claim perfection and point out other people's imperfections.
Absolutely.
Just shreds everybody. Puts everybody through the shredder.
Yeah. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's much nicer to use that. It's much easier to use that as a weapon and try and stop us from, getting on with our lives and doing more productive things. It's easier for them to be like, you need to buy all of these things to make yourself better and focus on improving all these things about yourself.
Yeah.
When actually, I'd be much better off if I could accept those things about myself and move on to the other things that I'd like to do with my day.
Cool. All right. Thank you heaps for your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we can wrap this up.
Awesome.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks heaps.
Really hope you enjoyed that interview and are also enjoying this podcast. If you fancied leaving us a 5-star rating or a lovely little review on good old Apple Podcasts, that would be really great. Massive, massive thanks to Olivia Hall and to all our guests for Season 1. Thanks to Outset Studios in London Bridge, the team at String Theory, to Andrew, Tanya, Brandon, David and Richard for their amazing voices, and to you for making it all the way to the end. Hang on in there for Season 2. It's going to be epic. Catch you later. Bye.
If you found some of this material a little challenging, keep coming back, and we'll make it really challenging.